Great. All right. Thank you, Ellen. And thanks everybody for taking time to let me tell you about what we've been doing with respect to supporting oyster restoration in North Carolina. The names below my name are the graduate students that did all the hard work that I'm going to present. So I want to make sure that, that I acknowledge them, and I'll bring them up again as we go through this presentation. I want to start out with the take-home messages, and the first one is very similar to the real estate industry, and that is location, location, and location. And so while it might seem obvious in terms of oyster restoration that location is important, it's not all that straightforward to figure out sometimes. The second take-home message is partners and leadership are key. And our main partner in restoration for oysters is the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. They're the state agency mandated for running these programs. And so they're the key partner, but there's also a tremendous amount of leadership from groups like the North Carolina Coastal Federation and the Nature Conservancy. So the Federation has done a great job of keeping us organized in terms of all the different research efforts that are focused on oyster restoration across the state. And the Nature Conservancy has been providing a similar role, but with the perspective of making sure that we pay attention to the natural reefs and managing those correctly. And then in terms of other partnerships, I just want to make sure we're aware that it's not just NC State, it's also our collaborators at UNCW, UNC Chapel Hill, and ECU, among others. And the last point is that it requires funding. And so a lot of the funding for our research comes from the North Carolina Sea Grant Program, from NOAA, from NSF. And during the 2008 Great Recession, there were some stimulus bills that were passed. And actually we were able to, through North Carolina Coastal Federation's leadership, get funding to create a large oyster reef in Pamlico Sound with that funding that actually helped a towing business and transport business stay afloat. So before I get into oyster restoration, I just wanted to put oyster restoration in a broader context of habitat restoration addressing grand challenges. And so the first one is food security. And so if we look at this middle slide, and we're looking at this salt marsh and living shoreline here, and just think about salt marsh or mangrove or seagrass or coral reef areas serving as structurally complex habitat that provides juvenile fishery species a place to grow up, and eventually they recruit into the fishery that's harvested. And so these, the coupling of these habitats with the subsequent fishery is absolutely important to food security. The second grand challenge is that a lot of these habitats provide ecosystem services that can help us to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so again, looking at this middle picture, that salt marsh, think of that as sort of working like a sponge, if you will. So if we get major floodwaters from, say, a hurricane, it's filling with water, is helping to what we call desynchronize that flood. And then during drought periods, then it's actually releasing that moisture. And the same thing with this living shoreline, with the idea that hopefully this is not only buffering wave action, but also those oysters are growing at the same rate as sea level rise. And then lastly, in terms of sustainable and resilient socioeconomic systems, both providing support for food security and ecosystem services is helping to support things like recreational fishing and ecotourism, as well as commercial fisheries. Okay, so why oyster restoration? This is a map that's showing the global decline in oyster reefs, and it's plotting it as a % of the global decline as a function of historic abundance. And so you can see in our part of the world, we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 5% of historic abundances of oyster reefs. And so before we get into restoration, just a quick overview of life history. In Pamlico Sound, we see the first major sort of spawning burst of oysters in late May. And so the oysters will release egg and sperm in the water column. That egg becomes fertilized and starts to develop as it's drifting around in the water column. And they disperse for about 2 to 3 weeks in the water column. And they actually they use this vellum up here to kind of beat it like a jellyfish and can sort of migrate up and down, but they're very weak swimmers. So they tend to go where the currents take them. And then after about 3 weeks, they'll settle typically on other oysters. They use some acoustic cues and some chemical cues to sort of drop down and encounter these reef areas. Oysters also provide important ecosystem services. So these structurally complex habitats help to support hundreds of species. We refer to these habitats as essential fish habitat. I've already mentioned erosion control through these intertidal berms or living shorelines, but also through their filter feeding and suspension feeding activities, they can limit phytoplankton production, and this can help reduce anoxia and hypoxia. So that can help to reduce low and no oxygen. So here's a great example of that. A little educational exercise we did with some elementary school kids, where this is Bogue Sound water with no oysters, a few oysters, and then lots of oysters. And so a pretty clear indication that they can clean the water of excess algae particles. The algae particles excess can settle to the bottom. They start to respire, and that can use up oxygen on the bottom. So there's 3 general types of oyster restoration in North Carolina. The living shorelines are typically led by non-governmental organizations such as Coastal Federation or the Nature Conservancy, and quite often involve citizen science groups. The other types of restoration programs are led by the Division of Marine Fisheries. They involve the creation of these culch reefs or the creation of large-scale subtidal reefs that form a network of Notake reserves or sanctuaries. And I'm going to develop each of these a little bit more in the next few slides, but this picture on the bottom right depicts a barge that's dropping 150 tons of limestone boulders to create one reef in sort of a checkerboard fashion of lots of reefs that are part of the large-scale subtidal reef network. So to go back to living shorelines, these are proposed as an alternative to bulkheads. So we know that the typical way of armoring a shoreline, use of these bulkheads. What we know, though, is that wave action that hits these bulkheads can start to erode the estuarine bottom in these areas, and you're actually starting to reduce this important shallow habitat, but also reduce the complexity of that shoreline, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a really important essential fish habitat. And so the living shoreline here, you build this, say, berm, and then maybe plant some salt marsh grass behind it, can reduce erosion and also provides living habitat. And the goal in North Carolina is actually to expand the use of living shorelines and actually continue to test alternative materials. This one I thought you'd be interested in. I just came across this from a Dutch colleague not too long ago, where they were actually working with a potato chip factory. And the waste from the potato chip factory they used to create scaffolding, which is what you're seeing down here. It almost looks like a wire basket. And they anchor these things out in the intertidal, and it receives natural oyster settlement. And then as the reef grows, the potato chip scaffolding starts to decompose. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, entrepreneurial opportunity, for testing these types of alternative materials. The culch reefs, again, conducted by the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. Here's an example of one of their small barges that's bringing this culch material out, and then they just blow it off the deck with a water pump. And so again, the goal is to restore commercially harvested reefs. So they place materials called culch on the bottom, and this could be oyster shells, it could be clam shells, it could be small gravel material that's we refer to as marl. And this material receives natural oyster larval settlement and hopefully begins to look something like this reef. But what we know is that, once again, location and vertical reef are incredibly important. And this is some work from one of my current PhD students, Olivia Coretti, She used this robotic boat. We called it an unmanned surface vehicle that actually you can program to go out, and we call it mowing the lawn, and it helps to create these really fine scale maps. And what we see that this particular culture reef is that in 2 years, we lost over 50% of that material. And so what we've learned over time is that location is important. If you build these culture reefs in areas that are relatively sheltered from wind energy that's going to move a lot of sediment, that's a good thing. But also vertical relief is important. So it's important to create these reefs that are about 1.5 feet above the estuarine bottom or more. If you have relatively low relief reefs in areas of high wave energy, then you're probably going to see a lot of sedimentation. So really important information in terms of trying to get the biggest bang for the restoration buck out of these culture reefs. And then the second type of restoration program conducted by the Division of Marine Fisheries is these Notake oyster sanctuaries. So the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries has created 15 sanctuaries or reserves. These are no-take, so no harvest of oysters, but you can hook and line fish on these. Here are these volcano-shaped mounds that I showed you earlier, and they create these in sort of this checkerboard fashion. The little dots over here in Pamlico Sound are certainly not to scale. These reefs are relatively small. It could be 4 acres, it could be up to 50 acres. And the distances range from about 10 to 125 kilometers. And so the goal of this sanctuary program was to create a self-sustaining network of protected reefs. In other words, they wanted to create sort of a larval insurance policy for the entire what we call metapopulation of oysters in Pamlico Sound. So about 12 years ago now, the director of this program, Craig Hardy at the time, came to my group and said, Dave, is this network self-sustaining? And to make a long story short, after a tremendous amount of field research and modeling, the answer was no, it's not self-sustaining. You need more reefs, and you need to put them in certain locations. And I think we can help with this knowledge gap of where best to focus future restoration efforts. So what I want to do is just give you a taste of some of the data that we collect and how we collect it that starts to feed into this idea of how we can guide future restoration or conservation efforts. And the first thing we need to know about is how these different locations are connected in terms of larval dispersal. So again, these oyster larvae are drifting for about 2 to 3 months. And so the question is, are there certain locations that provide a lot of larvae to other areas? And so the first thing we need to do is know something about water currents. And so we use a hydrodynamic model that predicts current velocities under realistic conditions of wind and tides. And then we can test the whether or not that model's valid by using current meters, such as this acoustic Doppler current profiler. And there's very strong agreement between predicted and observed currents with this model. And so then what we can do is we can put particles in this hydrodynamic model that mimic these oyster larvae. And we can release those particles from locations throughout Pamlico Sound and look at sort of export of larvae and import of larvae into certain of these locations. And we validated those larval trajectories with a satellite track drifter study, as well as a large-scale oyster spat settlement study that we did with working with middle and high school students throughout Pamlico Sound. So that gives us a good sense of oyster larval connectivity in Pamlico Sound. And just to give you an idea of how location matters, this reserve over here at Deep Bay, if we release larvae from there, you can see that they're relatively constricted to this sort of southwest portion of Pamlico Sound. In contrast, if we release some up here at, say, the Bluff Shoal area, you see really strong larval dispersal along sort of this northeast and southwest axis of Pamlico Sound. So we also need information on vital rates. How are these oysters growing? How are they surviving? What's their reproductive potential reproductive output like? And so we spend a lot of time diving, and it doesn't look like this, because if I were to take a picture, you wouldn't see anything except the inside of somebody's mask. So visibility is generally pretty poor, but we use these quadrats to collect a standardized amount of oysters. We bring them back, we measure them. We do this repeatedly to start to get estimates of density and growth rates. And then on a subset of the oysters, we can strip out their gonads and actually look at potential reproductive output. And that can tell us something about the potential contribution to the larval pool of a given size oyster, and also from a given Notake sanctuary. And just to give you an idea of what some of this demographic data looks like, size frequency is something that we often look at in fisheries science. And what you're seeing is that this is the mean frequency increasing from bottom to top on this y-axis as a function of the oyster size increasing left to right on the x-axis. And I want to start down here at the bottom. These are the Notake sanctuaries. And what you see is some fairly decent size structure where you have a lot of small oysters, and then they're slowly dying, say due to predation. And this hatch line right here is the size at which oysters can now be legally harvested. And so you can see in this Notake reserve that we still have a lot of big fat female oysters out here. So a lot of potential reproductive output. When we move up to the culch planted site, these areas are restored, but remember you're allowed to fish. As soon as those oysters grow into this size class right here, they can be harvested. So we see some pretty decent size structure. We see some adults, and then they get harvested fairly quickly. And then we go to natural reefs, and you see very little size structure and few, if any, of these big fat females. And so the fished reefs have really little to no adult oysters per unit area. Again, this is the frequency numbers per square meter. And the oyster reserves have a relatively natural size frequency and lots of large adults. And this is going to come into play when we talk about metrics for gauging success of the reserve network. Okay, so just some information on, giving you perspective of this entire, what we call oyster metapopulation. And this is work that comes from a recent PhD, Seth Tierkopf, who worked really hard to generate all this. And so basically what Seth has mapped are all the different types of oyster reefs in Pamlico Sound. So for example, the culch reefs we were just talking about, they're shown in green, kind of in these shallow embayment areas. Areas in purple are natural reefs, and you see the system is really dominated by these natural, what we call natural rocks. Intertidal areas, so these are think about rock riprap and pure pilings that are going to have oysters, and those are shown in red. And then we've got our little sanctuaries here as the black crosses. So based on the mean density of oysters in these different habitat types, the footprint of the reefs of these different habitat types, a very approximate estimate is that there's 32 million oysters in Pamlico Sound. And what's interesting is that when we look at the natural subtidal reefs, these natural rocks, they actually constitute about 90% of the reef area. And again, that makes sense looking at all the purple in this map. They contribute about 68% of the larvae that are distributed throughout this entire metapopulation. In contrast, the sanctuaries only have about 6% of the reef area, but they contribute about 25% of the larvae that feed this entire metapopulation. And so, about over 4 times the larval output of natural reefs. And there was a recent study published by RTI that looked at sort of the cost benefit of restoration. And there's a lot of ways to do this, but I think the take home was that $1 invested in restoration translated to $4 in benefits, whether it's from ecosystem services or harvest. So now we're going to get to this, the key questions in terms of habitat restoration is where to restore or conserve, because it's expensive and it also takes a lot of person power. And can we optimize for multiple goals? So can we optimize for this idea of metapopulation connectivity, which was the original goal of the Division of Marine Fisheries, to have sort of this larval insurance policy? But can we also optimize for ecosystem services? And can we optimize for recreational use? For example, hook and line fishing. And so what we can do is use these geospatial habitat suitability indices. We've referred to them as HSIs. And they're spatially explicit decision support tools. So they're location-based. And these HSIs have been developed to guide aquaculture and fisheries production and restoration of oysters. And so again, the question, where should sanctuaries be built and can we optimize for multiple goals? And so I want to go back to a lot of the vital rate data that we've been collecting. And we end up with something that looks like this, where certain, and I think this is characteristic of a lot of natural ecosystems, is that you end up with certain reserves where the oysters are relatively fast growers. We have certain reserves or sanctuaries where the oysters survive really well. We have certain sanctuaries where they seem to be really strong spawners. There's a lot of fecundity in these oysters. And then we have certain reserves that we can characterize as the relatively strong connectors. And so if I were to take this data and give it to a manager, they would look at me like, Dave, what am I supposed to do with all this? And so this is where I think the strength of those HSI tools comes into play, because we can start to integrate a lot of this information and produce maps that I think can help to guide restoration. So the sort of workflow to develop these HSI tools looks like this. And the first thing is to prioritize the relevant spatial or location factor data. So salinity is a really important one. The bottom type, you don't want to build a reef in soft sediment because it'll sink. But we might want to think about things like proximity to boat ramps that would provide hook and line fishermen access to these reefs, or think about distance to staging areas for the materials that would be barged out to build the reefs. And so with this first step, we actually partnered with stakeholders to get their opinions. And so we worked with the other academics, but also the fishery managers, some NGOs, and some fishermen, to get them to tell us, what are the important data layers, and then what is the kind of the weighting of those data layers, the relative importance. And again, Seth did a lot of work assembling that data. A lot of it was just, some of it literally in file cabinets. And so this was an important step in terms of just, liberating that data and then actually now synthesizing it to make sense of it and apply it. And so then the data went into a GIS-based suitability model. We validated that model against field observations, and then applied the model to inform restoration. And so where should sanctuaries be built? Again, it's this GIS approach. We created a grid of Pamlico Sound with greater than 6,000 square kilometer cells. We conducted those larval dispersal simulations, as I mentioned, over a 5-year period. We assembled 17 GIS layers, again, based on the stakeholder input. And the GIS layers had 2 categories. One was exclusion layer, the other was threshold. So an exclusion layer might be these military training zones. These are bomb training zones where in red would be no-go for oyster restoration, although I imagine it could keep a lot of people out from harvesting. So I guess it's a little debatable. Example of threshold layer would be here with salinity. So we're scoring this area right in here, these sort of middle salinity zones. It gets a value of 1. It's oysters grow really well there. Areas in red get a score of 0. The salinity is just too low for oysters to grow there. And then the area in yellow gets a score of 0.5. The oysters will grow there. It's relatively high salinity, but they're also more prone to disease and predators there. And again, the threshold weights, we gave salinity, it was a high weight, 30% was one of the highest scores. And again, that was from stakeholder input. And again, that was important in terms of getting buy-in to this tool by industry. And so when you put all that together, this is one example of what it looks like. And so, for example, suitable areas are in the dark green, they have the highest scores, and then areas in red are unsuitable. And you see a lot of red behind the Outer Banks. And what's driving that is actually water depth, because if you think about these volcano-shaped mounds, you need 6 feet of clearance between the top of that mound and the surface of the water so it doesn't create a navigational hazard. You see a lot of red in the middle of Pamlico Sound because there's a lot of deep areas that harbor a lot of relatively soft sediment that can get kind of re-energized and resuspended when we get these hurricanes. So this was a good first step, and the Division of Marine Fisheries works with us quite a bit to get our advice on where to restore oyster reefs. But we're also making this tool accessible to anybody in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. So for example, you can go online to this coastal resilience tool and you can play with these different layers. You can say, okay, well, I don't think salinity is that important. And you can slide back and forth and see how that changes where areas would be most suitable for creation of oyster reefs. And again, you can do this thing in terms of looking at the importance of, say, mulch planting sites. So starting to wrap up is with respect to trying to get the biggest restoration bang for the buck, and that is, can we optimize for multiple goals? And so again, some of the ecosystem services that we could try to optimize for might be water quality ecosystem services. It could be optimizing for fisheries production. We know certain species use these reefs as nursery habitat and juvenile habitat. Can we optimize for enhanced hook and line fishing opportunities? Or can we try to optimize for erosion control? So we picked water quality first because it felt like that was one of the more important ecosystem services and can help to promote and grow areas that would be amenable to shellfish aquaculture. And so the criteria for generating now this sort of water filtration HSI tool, the first question was, well, did we have spatially explicit data that would be available to go into this HSI? And did we have information on sort of functional relationships between oyster filtration and what's in the water column? And so what we ended up doing was using chlorophyll A as a proxy for phytoplankton biomass. So again, what we're proposing to do is control excess algae or excess phytoplankton through the filtration capabilities of oysters. We know just in general, you've seen this probably a lot, that a single oyster can filter 50 gallons of water per day, and you see it visually in these this aquarium example. But how can we get data on Pamlico Sound in terms of the distribution of, say, chlorophyll A? And so that's where we drew on satellite data. And actually, we teamed up with Blake Schaefer with the EPA. Blake was actually one of our former PhD students at NC State. And Blake has expertise in taking the satellite data that shows us something about the color of the water and then applying algorithms that tell us the concentration of chlorophyll A in the water. And so we were able to get the chlorophyll A data from the satellite data, and we were able to get sort of the functional relationships from the scientific literature. So for example, what's the relationship between an oyster's ability to filter and the flow of that water, the water velocity, as well as the amount of particles in the water? And so we generated these monthly chlorophyll A maps from 8 years of MERIS satellite data for Pamlico Sound. The water flow was generated from that hydrodynamic model that I mentioned earlier that was run over a 5-year period. And dissolved oxygen was generated from 522 stations that were sampled over a period of 18 years by the Division of Marine Fisheries. And we end up with some maps that look like this that are leading up to this final map. But we end up with something like this, where this is the suitability based on mean chlorophyll A concentration. And so what we're looking for are areas with really high chlorophyll A concentrations, because Pamlico Sound, the concentration never reaches a point where it would impede filtration by oysters. So the greater the chlorophyll, the higher the score it gets. And so you can see, and not surprisingly, these areas that are close to shore, which are getting nutrient runoff from land, are areas that show a lot of chlorophyll A. The other thing is we wanted areas with high chlorophyll A, but low variation in amount of chlorophyll A. And so those are areas that are scored in green as well. So high chlorophyll A, and consistency in that chlorophyll A. Down here to the bottom left is water flow velocity suitability. So what we found is that when the current speeds reach about 10 to 15 centimeters per second, oysters start to shut down. They start to stop feeding. And so we've scaled the optimal according to that relationship. So areas in green are areas where the water flow is delivering a lot of particles up to about 10 centimeters per second. And then flow rates past that are dropping down to being relatively unsuitable. And then this map on the bottom right is just showing areas that have relatively decent dissolved oxygen. So we can put all this together. We can put together the original work that we did, that original map that I showed you about suitable locations. And now we can combine it with this water quality HSI information. And we can end up with something like this, where this is sort of the top 1% of suitability or suitable locations. And if we're just interested in trying to reduce algal particles, we want to enhance water quality, then we would go with these areas that are shown in purple. If we wanted to just go with the original goal of Division Marine Fisheries, and that is to enhance this sort of larval insurance policy, then we would pick these areas that are in brown. But if we want to optimize for both this larval connectivity and water quality, then we would pick these areas in green. And so just to wrap up with some take-home messages, I think this, treating this system as a metapopulation and considering all the sources of oyster larvae in this system and these sort of spatial habitat suitability tools, I think are very powerful tools to integrate a lot of different data sources and to help guide spatial planning. The stakeholder input was really important in terms of the model development and enhancing buy-in to the output of this tool. I think the integration of ecosystem services allows for these win-win or trade-off decisions. So a trade-off decision might be, well, I'm more interested in metapopulation persistence than water quality, so I'm going to pick that, those recommendations. Or win-win could be, I'm going to pick the option that gives me water quality and metapopulation benefits. And then lastly, going through this exercise, especially by Seth, we identified a lot of data gaps. I mean, a lot of basic information in the scientific literature is still, there's still room for improvement. And so I think it's identified a lot of future work that needs to be done. During this exercise, we liberated a lot of data that I'm not sure would see the light of day for some amount of time. And then there was a lot of important synthesis of that data that came together and to now apply it in this way. And so with that, again, I appreciate you all tuning in, and let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I'm going to read them to you because I'm not sure that you can see them as they come in on the chat. Are there currently any oyster aquaculture farms in the Sound?
Yeah, actually, that is a big emphasis on this part of the state of North Carolina. They're starting to invest heavily in growing the shellfish aquaculture industry. And in fact, if we were to have an in-person oyster roast, you would be meeting with 6 shellfish growers in the state. We've typically had growers that range from Hatteras to sort of southwest Pamlico Sound down to near Topsail Island.
Awesome. Have you noticed any weather-related impacts?
Great question. Yes. We've started on another study that's focused on natural oyster reefs. And we were set to, basically one of the key issues is we don't have a fishery independent survey program that tells us the size of the natural oyster population that management can then use to tell fishermen how much they can harvest. So one of the keys to getting at that is to compare estimates of what's on the bottom using these scuba diver excavations with what the fishermen see when they pull an oyster dredge. So we were starting this study, and it was we were scheduled to dive during Florence. So obviously we had to wait until Florence was over with, and we were in an area called Middle Grounds off of the mouth of Pamlico River in southwest Pamlico Sound. And so we got the clearance to dive and went to the bottom where there's supposed to be a nice, huge natural rock, and it was completely covered in sediment, dead oysters, and the oxygen levels were essentially zero. That pattern repeated itself with Hurricane Dorian in the north. There's a big oyster area called Crab Hole up near towards Croatan Sound. And so the answer to the question is yes. We're in a shallow system that gets a lot of sediment redeposition during hurricanes. But as quickly as areas can become covered, I think areas can also become uncovered. And so I think one of the other important benefits of this sort of network of no-take sanctuaries is having this sort of spatial insurance. Because as we all know, hurricanes have different personalities, and they might be impacting the southwest part of Pamlico Sound and not the north, and vice versa. So I think there are a lot of reasons to have this kind of spatial insurance policy with this no-take sanctuary network. So good question.
All right. How much of the North Carolina oyster harvest comes from farms versus wild stocks?
The wild stock, I don't know the exact percentages, but the wild stock definitely is still the dominant source of oysters supporting the seafood industry. But again, I think that the NGOs and the state of North Carolina are really emphasizing growing the shellfish aquaculture industry. Virginia has been doing quite well with it, and I think is serving as sort of a system to emulate in many ways. And so when you look at where we are relative to Virginia, I think there is a lot of growth and a lot of economic growth potential.
Will the state restart the oyster recycling program again?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about that. I think everybody wants to do it, and we're waiting to see whether or not there'll be some funding to do that. But I think we should, and I think that I'm anticipating that it will happen. Right now, the current director of the Division of Marine Fisheries just retired, and I think there's an interim director, and I'm guessing that once there's a permanent director assigned, then we'll get some movement on that, I hope.
All right, there's lots of great questions in here. Can you discuss food safety related to oyster consumption?
Great question. Actually, CMAST has NC State has the only food science program in the state, and CMAST has the only seafood technology program in the state. And through recent state investment to grow the shellfish aquaculture industry, the state provided some recurring money that we then matched at NC State to establish the very first shellfish pathology program. And so the shellfish pathology program provides a service to the shellfish aquaculture industry.
He's talking about shellfish pathology program, and that NC State's the only school with a food science program, and they have linked the food science with the shellfish so that they can do some stuff together like that.
If everyone can keep their mics muted, please, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so the shellfish pathology program is working directly with the growers. And one complaint that we hear from the growers is that whether or not a water body is shut down from harvest depends on a lot of factors, but mainly rainfall in that area. And so the growers complain that while the rainfall totals for a certain regional area is causing them to shut down, it shouldn't be applying at the scale at which that operator might be operating. It may not be as much rainfall that entered that system as maybe a neighbor, 20 miles away. And so what the Shellfish Pathology Program is doing, and a lot of the Shellfish Sanitation Program with the Division of Marine Fisheries, is addressing that issue. They're sampling water quality and looking at things like E. coli counts. Shellfish Pathology Program looking at what's causing, we've seen some disease and spring disease outbreaks and mass mortality in certain what are called triploid oysters that you typically use in the shellfish industry. We see those events take place in the spring sometimes. And so the Shellfish Pathology Program is working diligently to figure out what's causing the mass mortality. Shellfish Sanitation is sampling the water quality to tell growers if they can harvest or not. And then the Food Science Program and Seafood Technology Program is basically training folks on how to handle that product so that you get the greatest shelf life out of it. So it's really a nice, and then there, Rachel Noble at UNC Chapel Hill is doing an incredible amount of work with kind of rapid assays of water quality as well. So there's a lot of effort being focused on how water quality metrics and how those metrics can be improved to support the shellfish industry.
Great. Okay, it looks like we have time for maybe one more. Why does fishing over reef reduce maturing oysters?
Oh, basically, they're hard. So if you saw that size frequency that I showed, what's happening is that basically as soon as those oysters hit legal size, they're getting harvested. But as you can imagine, you might be pulling a dredge through an area and you're also picking up large oysters that might have baby oysters settled on those. So you start to also remove some of the younger oysters in the process of moving the older oysters. But it's mainly from just harvesting once oysters hit that legal size.
Okay. All right. We're going to take just one more. We got one more minute. Let's see. Is there any blue crab research being done at CMAST? And if so, does it overlap with oyster research?
Oh, another great question. So yeah, there's two kind of research areas, one of which I did a lot of work on about 10 years ago and sort of have passed that baton, but there's a research being conducted. The goal is to see if we can raise blue crabs in the hatchery and then seed freshwater ponds with early juvenile crabs. And I know it sounds crazy, but you can take once a blue crab metamorphoses from being a larval stage to what we call a post-larval stage, you can start to reduce its salinity. And when it then molts into something that looks like a baby crab that you would see on the estuarine bottom, you can actually, over a period of about 5 days, acclimate it from, say, almost ocean salinity, almost down to fresh water. And so we've done that for many years. And then you can take those crabs when they're acclimated in the lab and you can stock them into freshwater farm ponds and they grow like gangbusters. And so there's a project right now working with Thomas Seafood in Beaufort, working with the aquaculture program led by Dave Serino at Carteret Community College. Eric Herbst with North Carolina Sea Grant is involved, and our partners with University of Southern Mississippi, with the idea of transferring the larval technology to North Carolina and then developing an industry that would provide seed crabs for folks that want to grow crabs in freshwater ponds. And then from a research standpoint, doing a tremendous amount of work looking at the role of shallow detrital habitats along marsh areas on the western shore of Pamlico Sound as important juvenile habitat for blue crabs.
All right, well, that took us right up till time. So I think that'll have to be the last question we can get to for the evening. Dave, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us and your insights on what's going on down at the coast. And I sincerely hope that we can hear more about it in person next year at the Crystal Coast Oyster Roast. We'll keep our fingers crossed on that one.
Great. Well, thanks, Ellen. I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you so much for your time tonight, everyone.